Welcome to this new video in our series API Payment Integration with Paystack. In this video, we're going to integrate payment with Paystack, extending the base API class we created in the last video. So let's dive right in. Now moving on, we can now create our Paystack API class, which will extend the base API class to provide functionalities to initiate and verify transactions. So create a file here, Paystack API.ts, and we define our class Paystack API, which extends base API. In this series, we will not be using dependency injection, so we'll go ahead to instantiate and export the Paystack API object. So we're going to have const Paystack API equal to new Paystack API, right? I'll export the default Paystack API. So here it's actually our base API requires that we instantiate it with a URL, so we'll do that in the class definition. So next, to create our constructor, and in this constructor we're going to call the super, and calling the super, we need to pass in our Paystack base URL. So remember, we actually defined that earlier on and added it to our config Paystack URL. That's what we're going to pass in to instantiate our super class on Paystack API. So we'll have config, which is from this config, and we're going to pass our Paystack URL as a string, because it can actually be undefined. So from the documentation, in order to make a successful call to Paystack, we need to specify some HTTP request headers. Remember, we'll have these content type and passing an authorization secret, right, to authenticate the user. So we're going to define our request init here. So request init equal to, so we're going to pass headers and content type as application JSON. This is in the documentation, and we need the authorization to have bearer, as we saw in the docs earlier on. You can still go ahead to look at the docs again in case you're confused. So here we'll also have it saved in our config, which is the Paystack secret. Good. So now I have this set up. We can now create a function to initialize payment. Define initialize payment, which would be an async function. So from Paystack documentation, initialize transaction has two required fields, which is email and amount. So let's create a type for our initialize function here. So let's go up here. I'll create a type initialize payment. So here I'll have the email, should be a string, amount should be a number, callback URL should be a string. So this is to specify or to override the webhook URL after payment transactions on Paystack website, like we saw earlier on. And finally, we're going to add a metadata attribute here, which is optional. has amount, string, email, string, name, string. Good. So we'll use this type in our initialize transaction argument to type it. Details of type initialize transaction. Nice. So I think we should better call it initialize payment args to denote argument. Next, make a post request to Paystack with the payment details as the body of our request as specified in the documentation. Response await this dot post. So if we go back to the documentation again, just to have a sneak peek, right? So in our initialize transaction, right? So the relative part is transaction initialize. So we need to specify that here. So have slash transaction slash initialize. We pass in the body, which is the payment details. We don't have any arguments undefined, and then we pass in our init. Yeah. So remember here, in order to make any call to Paystack, we need to set the content type and our authorization, right, to be the bearer and our secret, right? So define that in our request init here. So we can use that for any request I'm making in this Paystack API class. You can properly type this post request is actually returning an unknown, right? So let's properly type this. So we'll add another interface. Initialize payment raw response to be properly descriptive. And if you look here, our response from Paystack always on a status message and data here. So we need to specify that too in our response. So have status boolean message be a string and data. Go back to Paystack API, initialize transaction, get return an authorization URL, access code, and reference. So just specify that. So have authorization URL should be a string, access code will be a string, and the reference also be a string. So remember, we'll actually pass a generic to our post request when defining this function. So we'll just add it here. So this will now be properly typed, right? So our response now will now be a type of initialize payment raw response. So it's properly and nicely defined. So finally, return the response by converting it to a camel case using a util function I've added to make the response conform to JavaScript conventions of using camel case. So if you look closely here, I have a function I've added here, right, that converts an object to camel case from snake case. So you can have a look at it. I'll add the link to the GitHub repo here in this video, and you can always go back there and have a good look at it. So let's go back here. Good. So here we'll have return so we need to import this properly. So import from this. Yeah, good. So have this. We can also properly type this So let's add an interface also for our final initialize response. So we'll have interface initialize response. So it's just going to be this converted to camel case actually. So I can actually just copy this out, paste that here, and format this to camel case, since that's what our converter is going to do. So I'll save this, and can also use generics here because that's how the function has been defined, to accept a generic. Good. And then we'll have a look at this. Yeah, this is properly typed now. Yeah, so next we define our verify payment function. So we'll have verify payment. So here we'll just expect a payment reference. So if we go back to verify payment, right, we need a reference to verify a particular payment. So we're going to expect that reference to be passed in here. It's going to be a string. So we'll just return, it's going to be a get request as specified in the documentation. Here we're going to pass a relative path, right, which will be transaction/verify, and then we're going to pass the reference here. Good. So we'll have /transaction/verify. Then we're going to pass our payment reference. So we need to also specify the type using generics as demonstrated earlier on. So we're going to add a verify response interface. Verify response. I think verify payment response sounds better. So here we're going to get a status, which is boolean, a message, a string, data. So this data have a couple of things, but what we're mostly keen about, so if you go back to the verify response, right, so it has lots of data, right? So the things we're actually keen about is the reference and the metadata were actually sent earlier on, right? So we'll have the metadata, and then we'll also have the reference. You can also pick out the amount if you want to. So just go ahead and add that. So we'll have amount, number, reference, string, metadata. So expect the metadata to also have contain everything we sent earlier on. So the email should be a string, the name should be a string, amount should be a number. So take note of the response as stipulated in the Paystack docs. We need to specify this here. Good. So next we turn our focus to exposing this functionality via route. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed the video. Kindly subscribe, like, share, and turn on post notification to get notified when we post new videos, and encourage the channel to create more feature focused contents.